All right, so next we're going to talk about, we're going to continue a little bit from last week's cast when we were going over pitfalls for first time writers, and we're going to move into kind of a tips for first time writers direction. I don't know if we'll continue this exactly, but that's what we're doing right now, and you can't stop us. So, first thing we're going to go over for tips for first time writers is how to structure a story. And this is important in discussing when you're writing fan fictions or just any sort of story in general, is what separates a story, like telling a story to someone versus telling an anecdote to someone. Because,
AKA Shasine.
yeah, everyone knows how to tell an anecdote. Your anecdote can be as simple as, yeah, today I went to the store, I bought eggs and milk and cheese, and the guy behind the counter was a little bit rude to me, and that was kind of annoying. And then when I got home, I watched the football game. That's an anecdote, and that's something that everyone does. Everyone knows how to do that, and it's something that a lot of first-time writers, and sometimes not just first-time writers, can fall into, is telling anecdotes instead of stories. And it's really easy to do that with fan fiction. The reason for that is that with an anecdote, you're usually talking to someone you know, so you don't need to establish who you are, and you don't really need to establish other characters because they might know who you're talking about, or they get the idea, the type. You don't need to explain a rude clerk at a store. Everyone's seen a rude clerk at a store. They picture the specific person in their mind. And you have that with fan fiction because everyone knows who these characters are. You don't need to sit down and give Twilight's backstory to anyone in your fic because they're going to be annoyed reading that. That's one of the things where we were going over a little bit with the lavender unicorn syndrome last week, is that you don't really need to describe what Twilight looks like because we all,
Everyone knows that.
right, everyone knows what she looks like.
Yeah, if you're reading about that, like reading Twilight's background, ain't nobody got time for that.
Yeah, it's not necessary. It's stuff that you can and should gloss over a little bit. And
Exactly.
and that's one of the things with when writing fan fiction, is that you can kind of gloss over a lot of it. And in the process of glossing over a lot of it, you can fall into the pit trap of telling an anecdote, where it's like you're telling a story of stuff that these people or these ponies that you know did. And at that point, when you do that, you end up failing in the story. The story doesn't go anywhere. It works like an anecdote. And anecdotes can be entertaining, but they're entertaining mostly because you know the person involved. And the anecdote that I gave, I've heard anecdotes like that, and they're boring. And I've seen some boring fics that are just anecdotes. And this is to help you not do that, because nobody wants to do that. And so, in discussing a story and how to structure a story, it's good to know how stories are structured in general. So, to do that, we're going to break down story structure and give you an example. And the example we're going to use is the episode Too Many Pinkie Pies.
Yep. All right. So, Too Many Pinkie Pies starts off with uh, what the expedition, which is building up, what's going on. Pinkie Pie wants to spend time with both, Applejack and Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy, and so she tries to figure out something, and she finds the book.
Right. So this is the what would be in a story where you introduce characters, which they didn't really need to do in the show because it's a standalone story involving characters that have already been introduced. So that whole introduction of character gets glossed over in the show, which is why it's something that can easily be done in fanfic because you're just sort of considering it like you're writing an episode maybe. So that part is covered, and you're establishing setting. By setting, I don't mean where they are, which is that's one of the meanings of setting, so much as the setting of the story. What's going on? What's the point? So for Too Many Pinkie Pies, the point is Pinkie wants to be able to be available to everyone, even when what they want her for conflicts with each other.
Mm, exactly, and so that moves her into the where everything starts to build up towards Climax. So the problems start mounting, everything. She makes the clones. The clones go out and, they're want to have all the fun. And, they can't, they have three things they need to go to now instead of two. Oh, let's make another clone.
Right, and this is the rising action part of the story. And the way the rising action part of the story works is you first from the setting, you're introduced to a conflict. And the conflict in this case is that Pinkie Pie wants to be available to everyone, and she's going to go about doing this using the mirror pool. And from the conflict, you get consequences. And so the consequences for her is that just one clone isn't enough. And so from that consequence, she has the new conflict, and the new conflict is in producing more Pinkie Pies, which of course has further consequences in that maybe it's not enough and she needs more, or they're just going to go about it and do it on their own. And then from there, the consequences just continue to snowball out of control as it gets worse and worse. So this you can see it as it's built in the episode. The action is slowly rising up, whether the action is fighting or in this case just things getting harder to control and more chaotic.
Yeah. And so everything builds up to the climax of the story where everything comes to a head and the characters face their problem. In this case, they face the fact that they have now too many Pinkie Pies, title drop, uh, and they have to find the real one and get rid of the rest.
And of course, it's awesome that the climax, which is normally the most action-packed part of a story, if you're watching like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the climax of that story is the scene in the temple where Indy is going to get the Holy Grail and coming out from it. That's the climax. It's the most riveting, nail-biting part. And in Too Many Pinkie Pies, it's watching paint dry. So that's a great little inversion on what a climax would be in terms of level of excitement. But even in saying that, it is exciting in the story watching all of the Pinkie Pies slowly fail, whether it's by making the creepiest face ever, or a really spooky hand, or just being distracted by the world around them.
Yes. And so everything falls into place in the falling action and moves down until there's, only the last Pinkie Pie left. And everything is all hunky dory happy again. They put the boulder in place and resolve all the problems.
Right. So this so you can see the bell curve that a story takes. A story that's designed to entertain takes the shape of a bell curve, where at the bottom, at the start, you have the introduction and establishing the setting of the story. Then you have the rising action as the curve goes up. Then you have the climax at the top of the curve. Then the falling action as things die down as a result of the climax solving the problems. And then you have the ending, the conclusion, where everything is resolved and lessons are learned, or lessons aren't learned and things are forgotten about as quickly as possible because you don't want to think about that spooky hoof hand anymore.
Yeah.
And so this is the structure that all stories take. All stories are built this way. Even really long stories are built this way, although they're built that way in a slight difference. If you go into a really long story, it can have multiple bell curves where you have it broken down into scenes, where you can have action scenes that follow this, where they enter a room and they see the bad guys, and that's the setting. And then the fight gets off the ground, and that's the rising action. And then you have the climactic showdown with the bad guy in the room, and that's the climax. And then as he lays dying, he tells you where to go next, and that's the falling action. And then they leave the room, and that's the conclusion. And scenes are built that way. It's all things are all built that way in a story. And if you have a very action packed movie or an action packed fic or action packed book or whatever it is, it can be built in waves that follow a bell curve itself, where from the start of a story it's low and it has the full curve, and it ends at a point that's slightly higher energy than the start and goes into the next one that builds up to slightly higher, all the way up to the main climax of the story. And everything can be broken down like that a lot of the time when discussing entertaining stories. Uh, Anecdotes don't really have a structure like that. You go from point A to point B.
Hmm.
So, there are ways to play around with the structure a little bit. One of the most common that you can see in stories is beginning and media res. So
I
that's
was
where you
just gonna say that. That's
go
stealing all my
go
stuff.
ahead. You can. I've been talking for a while. You go ahead.
Fine. It's starting in media res, which means it starts in the middle of the action. Right. So your story starts as your character's fighting the big baddie. It's like, how did I get here? And then it goes back and tells the story in flashback until you get to that point, and then it goes on from there. Another common one is actually starting from the ends and having a bookends type where they uh, at the very end of the story they have like the best instance I can give of this is Fallout Equestria. It starts out like, this is my story. This is how I got here. But first, I'm going to need to tell you a little something about uh, stables and pit bucks. No, cutie marks and pit bucks. And that's how it starts. And at the very end, it calls back to that moment. And it's a circle that starts at the end of the beginning and goes back and around. And so you can have a little fun with things that way. But they still have that bell curve, even if they start somewhere else on there. Everything has that curve.
Yeah, and it's one that if you laid out certain stories that are told uh, out of sequence, where the chronology is played with, if you played it in the correct order, it would have that structure. But when it's messed around with, it also has that structure in a more subtle way. It's done in tone, and it's done in ways that really play with how things are paced and how they feel in reading them. That's why you can have a lot of action movies. You don't really see action movies that start at action and continue at higher and higher action and then end suddenly and it was just one long action scene. That's not really satisfying to watch. It's too much. You start to lose interest in the excitement of it because it's only exciting. And that's why so many of those have scenes that break it down, and you have moments of comedy and you have moments of where it's touching humanity or whatever it is, where it breaks up the monotony of the force of action with quieter moments. And that follows the bell curve there too, in that it's a falling action part of the story, and it can come at different points where it's necessary to get the impact that you're looking for in the climax. And it's something that you can definitely play with it. You don't have to go point A to point B with the curve in between them. And that's not the only way to tell stories, and it's certainly not necessarily the best way to tell stories is to just go from the beginning to the end. It depends on the story. And it's one of those things that if you're telling a comedy story like we were talking about before, usually if you're just going for a punchline joke, which is a perfectly acceptable way to write a comedy story. We touched on two really good ones. And
You start right the action like in Somber's Last Stand. They don't tell about how the rest of the empire's fallen to to everyone else. They don't like detail the story of them overcoming all King Somber's forces. They start right at when they get to the castle.
right, start right at the point where it's important to talk about it, where there's something funny to talk about, and then it just builds in the comedy. And that was one of the when I was discussing Last Stand of King Sombra, one of the things I mentioned was that they started with the strongest joke, and it would have been better to have the strongest joke at the climax for that whole rising action thing. And in that case, in that story, the rising action is the rising humor.
Yes, and it works well. It's still the story still works well, even though it should to go wrong with the rising action, it should have had a lot the rising humor, as Beth said. So
Yeah, I mean, this is not putting it down necessarily, just talking about it in terms of this structuring thing. And it's one of those things that if you're telling a straight comedy that's like that, where the whole point is to get to the punchline, basically a joke like that is told with you have the setting introduction, then you have the rising action, and then the climax is the punchline, and then maybe you don't have anything more than that. You can sometimes have more than that, and sometimes more than that can be funny in a different sort of way than that punchline. But that punchline is what you're really going for in that type of story. And sometimes the best way to do it is to end it there. And that's perfectly fine. That's a perfect way to tell a joke. And it all kind of depends on what sort of story you're trying to tell. And you can tell drama in this way, and you can tell sad stories and tragedies in this way too. And a lot of the times, how long that the falling action and conclusion are depends on the type of story you're telling. If you're telling an action story, usually the falling action and conclusion are fairly long, and that's one of those things that you can see clearest, I think, in Lord of the Rings. And
Mm.
the very end of the final movie is like 2 hours after the ring is destroyed. It keeps going, and that can be obnoxious to some people, myself included. But it's important on a story that long because there's a lot of aftermath to deal with. And if you end it too soon, it's unsatisfying. So action stories, I think, have the longest of that breakdown. And from saying action stories, it can be pure action, or it can be action that has more to say than just action. I think those types of stories are better anyway. And then it can be stories that are really involved and have a lot of things happen in them that aren't even necessarily action. You can have a real cerebral, emotional story that after the climax has a lot of things that it needs to unravel and deal with. And that can take a long time.
And sometimes, there are cases in where the climax can be at very, very beginning of a story, and everything is just, everything falling down and crumbling down after that. All the results just tumble out of order because of that.
Right. I have read plenty of stories, some of them extremely
Pilotus.
good, that start off with the character dying, perhaps off screen. It might not even have been covered in the story. It happened a month ago. It happened the day before. And what the story is it's all the falling action of the characters dealing with this as a result. And that's something, it's not for everyone. Not everyone wants to read that. I don't particularly want to read that a lot of the time, but I do sometimes. And that is a perfectly fine way to structure a story too.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So,
Basically, the end result of that is that in structuring a story and deciding what sort of story you're going to tell, you should keep in mind how stories are structured. That's the most
exactly.
important thing.
It,
Because you can play with it, you cannot follow the rules exactly. It doesn't have to, the climax doesn't have to be directly in the middle of the story. In fact, it usually isn't. It's usually much closer to the end. It's even the longest stories, it's going to be at least three-quarters of the way to the end. And that's just for a story that has the perfect curve. And it's just one of those things that if you keep it in mind and you really focus on it and you say, okay, I'm adding the scene here. Where does it fit in to the structure of the story? Why is this important to talk about? Because that's something that you should definitely pay attention to in writing. Is you can write something that's really long, but if it's full of incidental nonsense that doesn't have anything to do with the story, it's not going anywhere. It's not building the action. It's not resolving the action.
exactly. It just, make sure you know what you're doing. But it all leads back to know what you're doing. Try to have some kind of format planned out.
And it can be just a thing if you're writing a stream of conscious, which some people do. Some people write fics where they have this like a kernel of an idea and they write it until it's done. And some of those stories are really amazing. I personally don't write that way. I plan to excess sometimes on stories, but it doesn't. It's that's not a requirement of doing it. I think it should be a requirement if you're writing something that's really long. But again, personal bias. Um, but it's just when you're doing that, Even if you're writing stream of consciousness, when you sit down to write something, you think about why it's being included. It doesn't need to be a particularly important reason why. Maybe the scene is there just because you're writing a romance and you need to have the characters go daw at each other. And that's important. It's important to have those scenes because if you don't have those scenes, then you're left with something that's just a skeleton. But it needs to have a reason to be there.
Give it reason. Yep, that really is it. I
Yep.
think that pretty much sums it up. So, well, thank you for tuning in to us and our drifting rambles.
There was a little tiny bit of drifting
Not
here
much.
and there
Not as
and a
bad as
hell
the
of a lot of rambling.
yes. How oddly fitting that I provided the slight drifting and you provided the rambling.
And I certainly delivered on the rambling.
It was fine. Uh, well, good night. Oh, and anyway, bonus points if you can guess when we're recording this based on something said during the podcast.
Yes.
I will give you an internet cookie if you guess that. Someone leaves a comment on either mine, Bats's, or my blog post, Bats's blog post, or the video comments.
Yes.
So,
If you guess it, you get 2 internet cookies and perhaps a spike mustache.
mm, if you're on Fanfic, you'll get the extra spiked mustache.
Yes.
So, good night and keep calm and brony on.
Yeah.